Hello everyone, in this quick video we're going to discuss the relationship between in-text citation and works cited citation in MLA format. I find almost every semester, whether it's a Composition 1 or Composition 2 class, whether we are talking about philosophy, literature, science, any of the disciplines, students seem to have real difficulty understanding that an MLA formatted paper, in fact any paper using any citation style, needs to include both in-text citation and works cited or reference citation in order for sources to be properly documented. So if you look at most plagiarism policies at most institutions, if you fail to cite a source properly, even if you attempt to cite the source, if you fail to do so properly, it is considered plagiarism. It is considered academic dishonesty, and it could be grounds for the paper to not receive a passing grade. And one of the ways students often make mistakes is they do not have in-text citations and they have works cited citations, or the opposite. They'll have works cited citations they'll have in-text citations and no works cited citations. Another issue that I often see is students mixing citation styles. So I'll see in-text citations that are APA format, but works cited citations that are MLA format. All of those sorts of errors communicate sloppiness, laziness, a lack of focus, and a lack of care on the assignment. So those things do impact the way the essay, the writing is interpreted or graded. And one of the main ideas I try to get across to all of my students is interpretation is more important than intention. So you may have intended to do the citation correctly, but the interpretation that the reader has when they recognize incorrectly formatted citation is that you intentionally didn't do it well and that you skipped an important part of the process, which is documenting your sources. So a large part of what this video is going to help with, I hope, is helping you to understand why in-text citation and works cited citation is necessary, why both must exist in order for a source to be properly documented. Just a heads up as we're beginning this video, I know the screen with the blinking cursor is a little boring to look at. I apologize. I'll try to get through this introductory stuff very quickly. I'm going to be using a couple of different texts from a couple of different institutions to illustrate this. But to illustrate this relationship between these, the in-text citation and the works cited citation, the sources I'm using are going to be coming primarily from books. So the citations I provide for you will be based on books. Another resource that I will use to help me illustrate this, so I'm going to pull this up quickly, is Purdue University's Purdue Online Writing Lab. And we often call this OWL at Purdue. And this is a great resource. Some institutions will have you purchase a book version of a handbook, what's called a handbook, which gives you advice on in-text citation and works cited and gives you models and how to do that. This is the online version of a handbook. It's absolutely free. It's updated every time a new edition of a citation style comes out. And it's great to use this as a reference. And you see I already have pulled up here MLA in-text citations, the basics. So if you are a student who has taken a writing course many years ago and you learned rules many years ago, there's a good chance those rules have changed and your handbook, your paper handbook, no longer applies. This handbook, this online handbook, is your new reference. Okay, so now that we've covered all of that, let's talk about the relationship between these two things. I'm going to go ahead and set this up super fast in MLA format, which is something I covered already in a previous video. So I want to do this though because I just need to get in the habit of doing it every time. It's important to not skip that step. So let's see here, because I'll make more work for myself if I do skip the step every time. And forgive me, I'm working on a laptop with a trackpad, so it doesn't always want to, the buttons on here don't always want to work with me too well. Okay, and again, our focus is MLA format. And MLA primarily uses this term works cited for the works cited entry. So I have here the basic setting for the format, and I'm writing a paper for my literature professor on William Blake's poetry, and I love William Blake. So I am going to cite from the Norton Critical Edition of Blake's Poetry and Designs. And hopefully my teacher has showed me how to set up a research journal, and I already have that set up, and in that I have citations, but for our purposes I haven't already set up a research journal. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my works cited page, and recall that the works cited page is always the last page of the document. It is not a separate file. It is the last page of the document of the paper itself. And we have to have hanging indents, so I'm going to go ahead and pre-format it in my hanging indents. If I go ahead and set up everything pre-formatted, it makes my life a lot easier. So I'm using the Norton Critical Edition, so there's a lot of people in this. There's some additional information I'm going to have to provide. So the first thing I know is the primary author is William Blake. And then the title of this Norton Critical Edition is Blake's Poetry and Designs. And I actually have an editor, and this is a second edition, so I have to put that information in here. I have two editors. Since I have two editors, I have to mention their names. Both names. If I had more than two, there's a way to do that, and you would have to look that up on something like Al at Purdue or a handbook. And then this is the second edition, so I'm going to provide that information as well. Now, we know the publisher, of course, is Norton. So, since it's a Norton Critical Edition, right? And they actually use the full name, so in order to be fair, we're going to use the full name as well of the company. Make sure it's italicized properly. And then the date. So we know, since this version I'm looking at is the second edition. Okay, so now I have this works cited entry, and I want to point out something very important for the reader of my paper. When they get ready to read my paper, I have my works cited page alphabetical, and the name that appears first is the last name. So anytime I refer to a quote from this text, I am going to either put in the signal phrase introductory clause, that's the little subordinate clause that comes at the beginning that lets my reader know I'm about to quote or paraphrase from a source. I'm going to either put the author's last name, full name, or at the end I'll put the last name in parenthetical. I would never, ever in an academic paper or a research paper refer to the author only by their first name. This is considered bad form, and also just on a fundamental research level, it makes it much more difficult to identify the source when I'm discussing the author. So I am going to pretend, for our sakes in our discussion, that I'm writing a paper now about Blake's poetry, and I'm in my body section, and I'm rolling on this. I've got some great ideas, and my topic is going to be something like Blake in his poetry develops his own mythology. This mythology is loosely based on the Judeo, and I have to capitalize, Judeo-Christian tradition. So my reader now knows that in this paragraph, those two sentences introduce my subtopic, that I'm going to talk about how Blake is influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition. And then I am going to find something in one of his poems, larger poems actually, that is tied to that concept, okay? So when I look at, say, his work, Book the First, because he is a poet who organizes his text by books. And I look at Milton, Book the First. I'm going to skim through it, and I'm going to find something that is tied to Judeo-Christian concepts. And I come across the lines. So, for example, we find early in the poem Milton, and notice how this poem title is placed in quotations instead of italicized or bold. In MLA, if something is a smaller title that appears in a larger container, they use the words container, but we can think of it as work, we put that title in quotes. If it's the larger title, like the title of this Norton Critical Edition, which is Blake's Poetry and Designs, that title's placed in italics. So often the size of the source will determine its title format. So, for example, we find early in the poem Milton, and notice here, this is called an introductory clause. Whenever I talk about signal phrases or introductory clauses, that's what I'm talking about. And I believe the quote I'm going to use is longer than a few lines because it is a line of poetry. So when I'm doing a works cited entry or an in-text citation entry, that's a block quote, that's more than a few lines, I need to go ahead and indent every single line. So that's why having a ruler up is very helpful. And then I'm going to scroll down here and I'm going to quote these lines from the book. 3 classes are created by the hammer of Los. And Los is a mythological creature, as is woven, that Blake invented. By Enith Darman's looms when Albion was slain upon his mountains, and in his tent throw envy of living form, even of the divine vision. So again, hopefully you've set up a research journal, and that's something I will talk more about in another video, how to set that up for my composition classes that are required to use it. And so you wouldn't typically, when you're writing, have to spend this time typing out the quote from the book. You could just cut and paste it. And that's also true if you're taking a source from a website or an online article from a database. Now, I know many people tell you that you cannot cut and paste, but if you're doing what I have done here with an introductory clause and the proper in-text citation and the proper works cited entry, you can cut and paste as long as the majority of the writing on the paper is in your own words. Okay, so that's something you just learn over time as you become more comfortable with this sort of writing. And I apologize, I'm actually not a very fast typer either, so I'm often looking for ways to make this process go faster. I'm almost done with the quote. Alright, so, and then notice, because this is a block quote, it's a little weird. MLA 8th edition has this rule with the block quote, there's no quotations around it, and you're going to put the parenthetical following the period. Now, I already mentioned Blake up here, and I haven't talked about any other text, so I actually don't have to put Blake's name in the parenthetical because he's already mentioned here. And that sort of serves as an introduction to let my reader know that this text is obviously Blake's. Okay, so now I went back to that format, and I have my first in-text citation. So that is called an in-text citation or a parenthetical citation. Now there's a couple things now here that shows me as a reader, as a researcher, if this was a paper I found online that I then wanted to use as a source for one of my own papers, I would look at this and I could track this author's source. I could track this author's thinking. So in this body section that they have here, I know that they're talking about Blake, and I know that this quote is coming from one of Blake's poems, and these 3 sentences here work sort of as an introductory clause, and it lets me know that it's coming specifically from the poem Milton. And now I can see the page number, so I know it's coming from a book, I know the page, and then I go to that author's works cited page, and I see here Blake, it helps me find it, and I see that this is the book where that comes from. And so I have to have all of that information in the in-text citations and the introductory clauses in order to help me identify the source. So then, let's say I wanted to write something continuous in another body paragraph in another paper where I'm referring to an article that doesn't have an author. For example, this MLA stuff here, this MLA page, this doesn't have an author to it. I've skimmed it many times, and many of you will use sources that are done like an organization, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're not credible. Usually I tell students not to use sources that don't have authors, but something that's just a reference like this, sometimes you have to do that. So in that case, what I would have to do is, again, I would set up the works cited entry. I know that the first piece of information that's going to go in there is this MLA in-text citations, the basics. So I'm going to go down here to my works cited page, and I know that since that is a website, I know that I'm citing a page that's part of that website. I'm not citing the whole page. So I would go in and I would give the title of the page. I'm not citing the whole website. In-text citations, the basics. and period. And then I would put the website's name, which we know is Purdue Online Writing Lab. So we're going to go here to Purdue Online Writing Lab. And for my readers, I'm going to put in OWL because that's what most people know. And then I need to find out the last time this page was updated. And depending on the web page, you got to do some searching to find this often. I'm seeing that the most recent here is showing 2020, so I'm just going to assume that 2020 was the last time this was updated. And then with websites, I don't have a specific date, so I just got to put the year. But with web pages, they usually want the URL as well, and the URL is just that information. Now notice this is not formatted with a hanging indent, so I have to go up here and I have to fix that. And you know, that takes a little bit of maneuvering. So in this instance, since I don't have an author, the first piece of information that appears in this Works Cited entry is actually the article title. So I would say something like MLA in-text citations. And then I could go up here and let's just pretend it's a different paper. I'm writing a different paragraph. I'm going to have something along the lines of a student who is looking for information on properly creating an in-text citation should definitely look at, and then this is italics, right? Purdue Online Writing Lab. I have to go in and do my spell check. In-text citation is something students often struggle with, but the concept is relatively simple. On OWL, and I need to go back up here and put in parentheses OWL to let people know that that acronym refers to the Online Writing Lab. We read, and then I'm going to find a good quote real quick that I can use. So we're going to put this quote in, and notice I'm copying and pasting. Now I have to go in because I copied and pasted, and I have to fix my font, make sure it's 12 point, right? And then notice this color is different, and sometimes people will, you know, they will mark you for having a different color font. Now here's one of the problems though. We have to determine this is yet again a quote that's more than 4 lines, so again I have to put it in block quote format. And now we have to figure out what's going to go right here because we don't have an author. And what goes in the parenthetical is actually MLA in text citations. And the reason for that is if we look at the Works Cited page again, This is the first piece of information, so my reader can literally scroll down to the Works Cited page or turn to the Works Cited page and find that information. So that's the basic relationship between in-text citations and Works Cited entries, and why they're so important, and why both have to appear in order for citation to be properly done and for you to avoid plagiarism. Very important that both appear. If either is missing, you have failed in your intention to document the sources that you have used properly. I hope you found this video educational and enlightening. If you have any questions, you can email me or message me directly through one of the LMSs. Have a good day.